A very warm welcome to Interface. My name is Thembi Samachele. Well, we all saw the tragic scenes of terror at the Garissa University in Kenya, where 148 students were killed by Al-Shabaab militants. This has once again raised concerns about the ability of the Kenyan government to deal decisively with Al-Shabaab and with terrorism in general. Before this, we saw the attack on the Westgate Mall in Kenya, and we also saw Boko Haram terror activities in Nigeria. Now, in Interface this week, we are once again looking at Africa's ability to deal with terrorism. And of course, we are asking that question that is very important to us as South Africans: are we in South Africa safe? Let's welcome our guest. Kate Stegeman is a researcher at Good Governance Africa. Nompumelelo Mutlafi is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of South Africa. Now, before we get into our discussion with our guest, let's take a quick look at this insert produced by Kinosi Queen.
The attack on mostly Christian students at the Garissa College in Kenya last week has been described as the deadliest act of terrorism in the East African country since the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi in 1998 by Al-Qaeda. Experts say the recent attack calls into question Kenya's ability to ensure the safety of its citizens. Following the massacre, many questions are yet to be answered. Did the authorities ignore intelligence warnings? Is Kenya's counter-terrorism strategy doing more harm than good? And most significantly, where were the security forces when the tragedy unfolded? Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta has laid the blame on the radicalization of the youth in that country. But the International Center for Policy and Conflicts based in Nairobi disagrees. The center's director, Ndungu Wainana, accuses the government of lacking political will to transform security in Kenya. He says the government could have foiled the attack had it implemented the reforms introduced 5 years ago. According to Wainana, Kenya adopted a new constitution in 2010 which granted the police autonomy. He says the government has not implemented laws aimed at transforming the intelligence, police and defense forces. Human Rights Watch Kenya has also criticized Kenya for failing to implement reforms of the security agencies. The organization says the culture of human rights abuses and corruption within these agencies has to be addressed in order to make the country safer. In a groundbreaking research by the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, senior researcher Anneli Buota surveyed Kenyan members of Al-Shabaab and the Mombasa Republic Council, MRC. She asked what motivated them to join the Islamic movement. The majority blamed injustices at the hands of Kenya's security forces, specifically collective punishments and Kenya's counter-terrorism strategy. Analysts say a concerted effort is needed to address the social problems faced by many of the citizens of the countries challenged by Al-Shabaab in order to end security problems in the Horn of Africa. According to the 2014 Global Index report, there were a total of 10,000 terror attacks across the globe in 2013. Close to 18,000 people were killed. Almost 15,000 died in just 5 countries, including Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Nigeria. Here at home, experts have warned of a growing evidence of Al-Shabaab's presence within South Africa. But how credible is the Al-Shabaab threat to South Africa? Kinosi Queen, Interface, Johannesburg.
So let's just remind you then that if you would like to take part in this discussion, as always, you can find us on Facebook at Interface on SABC2 or on Twitter at Interface on SABC or at Thembi Samachele. We'd welcome your thoughts and we would love to take some of them as we go along in the program. Let's welcome our guests, Kate and Nompumelelo. Thank you very much for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So let's first get this question, which I know is burning in the minds of many South Africans in particular. Are we in this country safe from terror attacks, Kate?
Well, people were very concerned recently when we saw a young girl, an attempt by our intelligence structures to stop a young girl who seems to have been recruited by ISIS or the Islamic State. And I think that got a lot of people incredibly concerned about what kind of conditions are available in South Africa, and whether or not we have the kind of people who are open, the youth in particular, to be radicalized. And
particularly online, hey?
Absolutely, and they do use those kind of methods, and that is concerning. But with regards to South Africa in the greater scheme of things, and with regards to whether or not South Africa is a threat from Al-Shabaab, South Africa is not involved in Somalia right now. We don't have troops in the UN force, so it's unlikely that there would be any kind of vengeance attack, firstly. Second of all, politicized religion is less of an issue in South Africa. We generally, I don't have quantitative or qualitative evidence necessarily for this, but we generally have a good relationship with Muslim people in South Africa. So it would be unlikely that Al-Shabaab would be able to come here and recruit young radicalized youth because they felt that Islam or Islamic population or minority had been in some ways discriminated against. We have other issues in South Africa and huge manifestations of violence, but when it comes to terror attacks, I think that seems like less of a threat right here.
So what we keep hearing from the authorities is that they've got this under control, they're doing everything they can to protect us as citizens. But it's not necessarily Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram that we should be worried about. It could be anything or anyone in the world. Do you think the government is doing enough, Nompumelelo, to protect us as citizens?
The government has done what it could in terms of propagating this idea of, a rainbow nation, and that there's space for everybody in this country. What I worry about, though, is there seems to be some disgruntled feelings over the fact that South Africa has not really taken sides on issues such as the Palestine-Israeli conflict. I think some people wanted the government to make a stronger stand, and that could be a reason for frustration, and in future we might see a heightening of the risk. I don't know, but I seem to agree with Kate that there are a number of points of conflict in the country, and whether Islamic terrorism as such is the highest risk is very questionable at the moment. But it's also interesting to note that for a while now we have been on, there have been early warning mechanisms which have predicted that there might be wide-scale violence such as genocide in South Africa, and so far that hasn't happened. So we don't know, we are expecting violence, but the nature and scope and extent of the violence is not clear at the moment.
The one thing we do also need to bear in mind, obviously, though, with regards to South Africa's involvement in sort of counter-terrorism activity, is that there are South African mercenaries in Nigeria. And so although we are geographically incredibly far away from Boko Haram cells and Al-Shabaab cells, if there was any fear whatsoever, it would be, I think, more likely that it would come from South Africa's private involvement, as in mercenaries and illegal activity, and not state-sponsored.
Not state-sponsored.
More than anything else. But yeah, I mean, right now it seems it's too early to predict anything like that, and hopefully we're all safe and we have intelligence structures that are working hard to keep an eye on our country.
That's right. We're going to take a short break, but let me just mention that we do use the phrase Islamic terrorism very loosely on this show. It's just for reference sake, but we do understand that the fact that the terror groups purport to be of Islamic origin does not mean that this is an Islamic offensive. So do bear that in mind as you also send your tweets and your Facebook messages through to us. Do stay tuned. We're back after this. Welcome back. We are chatting to Kate Stegeman, who is a researcher and political analyst based at Good Governance Africa, and we're also in conversation with Nompumelelo Mutlafi, who is a political science lecturer at UNISA. So we've talked about the South African aspect. Let's get back to Kenya. Why is Kenya seemingly so vulnerable to terror attacks? There was the Westgate attack, and now there's this in a very short space of time, Nompumelelo.
Well, this is actually an area with which Katie is more familiar with, but in terms of my basic knowledge of it, my understanding is that Kenya has seemed to be very close to the United States, has a lot of interest with the United States, has a lot of interest with Israel, which are the groups which certain elements within the global jihad have a problem with. So I don't know, Kate, do you want me to, want to help me with this?
I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, with regards to Al-Shabaab in particular, we have to bear in mind that they are aligned with Al-Qaeda. So the US obviously has some relevance in terms of the fact that the embassy was attacked some time ago, and that was the biggest terror attack we have seen in Kenya. But looking particularly at Al-Shabaab now and why they've been on the rise and why they're attacking Kenya, it's important to realize that obviously this started in Somalia and that Al-Shabaab is an insurgent movement that is vying for power in that country. And when the regional force stepped in to try and curb the spread of Al-Shabaab, we saw a united an African Union mission with troops from Ethiopia, with troops from Uganda, and with troops from Kenya. And what happened is that we then started seeing Al-Shabaab attacking the north of Kenya more and more. So they were coming from their stronghold in the south of Somalia and entering Kenya. So you have a kind of an insurgency battle there, and you have trying to quell their stronghold. But then what has happened as a result of that is that they also seem to have now adopted a very heinous strategy of tactics of terror. So I don't like to talk about Al-Shabaab as terrorists. I like to talk about them as an insurgency group who have adopted acts of terror.
But be that as it may, Kate, they have already shown their hand to the Kenyan government. They have already been a threat to that government. You would think that by the time the Westgate massacre happened, that the government would have been on high alert, but seemingly it wasn't. What do you make of the response of the Kenyan government in this?
Absolutely. The Kenyan government's response, both to Westgate and to Garissa, has been unacceptable, and I use that word not lightly. We saw in the aftermath of Westgate, I mean, straight after the attack happened, that the government and military sent in forces who were ill-prepared, who were under-resourced, who actually set off certain stun grenades that may or may not have collapsed certain buildings certain floors in the Westgate Mall complex itself. Over and above that, their intelligence collecting was just absolutely shoddy. They should have known prior to the Westgate attack that Al-Shabaab had already hired a shop in the Westgate Mall complex. So their intelligence collecting to preempt the attack was completely and utterly flawed. Their response to the attack in the aftermath of the siege and the hostage-taking, unacceptable. Over and above that, we have had a flawed legal system where we haven't necessarily seen enough of the gunmen apprehended and tried in a court of law, which is what I think many deceased members of the Westgate attack in particular in Kenya would have liked to have seen. So we're hearing some sort of arguments about, oh, well, we got hold of some gunmen who are linked to Al-Shabaab and we bombed them there or we attacked them there. That's fine, but we want to see them arraigned and in court. And the problem is that not only is the Kenyan military ill-equipped to do this, and in the aftermath of Garissa as well, they ignored intelligence intel as well. So they should have known, because Al-Shabaab sent out alerts saying that they were going to attack a university. So it would make sense that they would attack a university in the area in the north, which is Garissa, which they ignored. And they've got a number of police units and anti-terror attacks, anti-terror units that have been involved in the most unacceptable extrajudicial killings. They've not followed procedure in terms of
So the argument that there's
terrorists.
no political will, in your view, is actually correct?
Yes, and a flawed strategy, over and above political will, a flawed strategy, a lack of counterterrorism strategy.
But I would be interested to hear why there's a perception of a lack of political will. I wouldn't understand why would Kenya not care about its citizens when in the past, even though it was not the Uhuru administration, they have sort of expressed the concern that Kenyans have been harmed because of their interests with the US. I don't understand now why they suddenly...
Let me put a theory to you then. Mr. Kitongo, who is with an anti-corruption group in Kenya, very well known in the world about on his work on this particular issue. He says that the reason why there's no political will is that there is entrenched corruption even within the security aspect of Kenya. So people are really lining their own pockets and they're not looking after the Kenyans themselves, the citizens.
Okay.
Would you Would you agree with that, Kate?
Absolutely, and we've seen in the response to the Garissa attack, I mean, I understand that there have been an estimated 130 attacks by Al-Shabaab recently in Kenya. I understand that that is difficult for the Kenyan government to deal with. I do not in any way think that the Kenyan government don't care about their citizens to the point that they would in any way turn a blind eye to the heinous attacks and the murders and the killings and the separating Muslims and Christians. I don't think they would in any way do that. But you just have to look at Kenyatta in particular's response to the attack recently. He did not arrive at the morgues. He has not arrived to Garissa himself. He has not seen any survivors of the attack. He has not attended the memorials or vigils or anything organized by Kenyan civil society. Yes, he recently sent out handwritten letters, but that's a disingenuous response. Kenyans want to see that you have a proper counter-terrorism strategy. So for you to sit and write letters and then to jet into one of your recce squad's funerals recently and to politic with the opposition rather than addressing the fact that your units are ill-equipped to deal with this and that you don't have the right strategy, it's too little too late, Mr. Kenyatta.
I do want us to touch a little bit on what's happened in Nigeria, since we saw those girls being taken in. But one of the most interesting things that I read that you put forward, Nompumelelo, is that African Islamic terrorism, which once again, I must mention we use very loosely, could be a sign of a long-term failure of the Pan-African project. Why do you say that?
Well, I would like to explain a bit of my background. I am more familiar with the study of genocide than with terrorism, but terrorism and genocide are both instances of political violence. And when political violence occurs, I question, what is the role of identity in all of this? In Rwanda, we know that identity had to do with how resources were distributed within that country. It had to do with how power was distributed within that country, and there seemed to be no space for sharing. So we had to get rid of one side.
Can I ask you to just hold that thought? We've got to pay the bills. Unfortunately, we have to take another short break. We're back after this. Welcome back. We are now wrapping up our conversation talking about the terror attacks that we've seen on the African continent and also taking your thoughts on Facebook and on Twitter. Ozzy says, South Africa is one of the best armies in Africa. Our soldiers have been trained in the US. We can handle a bunch of hooligans with AK-47s. Well, I hope you are right. Spiwa Kulana says, Europe has been invaded by these terrorist groups and Africa is not immune either. Terrorists don't announce when they are coming, and the only thing we can do as a country is to guard our border posts. Candice Nsele says, we are not safe as long as our borders are open to anybody who does as they please. Simpiwa Mtambo says, let's ask ourselves why most Islamic states have so many conflicts. Is it due to religion, or is it because they're trying to resist Western imperialism? So keep those thoughts coming. I mean, we are not going to try and solve this in one show and one take, but we do want to continue the conversation also off air when we are finished here. But let's talk about this particular issue. So, Nompumelelo, we're talking about the role of, Pan-Africanism in this. So what are your thoughts as you answer that question on the role of the AU, the Pan-African Parliament, and everything that they have or have not been doing to deal with this matter?
Okay, in my understanding of Pan-Africanism, there was an initial view of working together and having a common identity as Africans in facing our problems. And so far, I think that the African Union has either lost touch with the grassroots or it's just not seen to be effective. And perhaps with what others call global jihadism, here are people who are taking a principled stance and looking at standing for what they believe in. And I'm thinking of the English word for it, of just, just saying, okay, this is an alternative view of what the future could be. This is how we could go forward. And we are actually willing to take action in terms of realizing our goals. Has the African Union done anything strong, that could be compared to what global jihadism is willing to do? And
so is
I would say no.
The dream of the African Renaissance
unity.
and unity, has that been derailed in your view then?
I would say that the idea of global jihadism has given it a run for its money at the moment, yes.
Well, Kate, we hear from the Kenyan government that they want to build a wall now separating Kenya from Somalia. It's going to stretch for 680 kilometers. Is that the solution?
Absolutely not. If they have enough resources to bolster their counterterrorism activity, then what they should be doing is training more officers to try and root out the new recruits of Al-Shabaab. And so they should try and find them. So if, for example, they are now saying the Kenyan government has given the UN a 3-month ultimatum and says if you don't move the refugee camp in Dadaab, we will move it ourselves, which basically is unacceptable. But they're saying that it's a breeding ground for potential new recruits for the Al-Shabaab insurgency. And I think what a lot of civil society and human rights groups are saying in response is there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people living in those refugee camps that have been living there for nearly 2 decades. If you're going to send them back into the border, into Somalia, what you're basically going to do is that they're going to lose their refugee status and become internally displaced people, which means they have a lack of protection from various sort of international organizations. And what they think they will do with the wall is that they will stop Al-Shabaab coming into the country. But now the most important thing, and this is something that the political analyst Ryan Cummings has written a lot on, is that we need to remember that the gunmen in Garissa and in Westgate and various others are not just Al-Shabaab Somali people, radical Muslims. They are sleeper cells within Kenya themselves. So I would rather see the Kenyan government root out who are the gunmen, who are the masterminds behind this, who are around the world in the network as well as in Somalia.
Or maybe
a wall's not going to stop them.
Right, and maybe they can learn from Nigeria, because we heard that President Goodluck Jonathan was telling us that they are winning the war against Boko Haram. Do you buy that story?
Do I buy that story? Well, I would say that the votes of the Nigerians spoke louder than anything else.
Fair point. But what can we do now in closing? What do we do?
Well,
Kate?
I mean, just with regards to Boko Haram and in Nigeria in particular, what has worked there, and to go back to African Union and their role in security, is that we have seen regional forces step up and offer massive assistance in curbing their activity. So we've seen Chadian soldiers as well as Cameroonian, but the Chadians are particularly strong in that region, and they have had strides. Similarly, with Ethiopians in the regional African Union force within Somalia and Kenya. So what I would like to see, in particular, or Good Governance Africa, or anyone from a civil society initiative and with a security background, is to bolster those regional efforts, to give them more training and more resources, and to root them out, not to take it out on the Somali refugees, not to take it out on your Kenyan citizens by not being prepared for attacks, because more might come.
We have to leave it there, ladies. Thank you so much. I wish we could have had a little bit more time to talk about this, but thank you for coming through to talk to us on this matter. Thank you for making the time to join us here on Interface, to join us again next week at the same time. Good night.